Welcome back to Sociology Droids. This time we're going deep on Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. You've given us like a ton of excerpts, and you seem really interested in Foucault's core arguments about how punishment has changed and that whole disciplinary power thing. Foucault always makes you think, right?
Yeah, he really does. Foucault definitely makes you rethink those assumptions about power and control.
Exactly.
To really get his arguments, we need to kind of follow his lead and trace the history of punishment. And what better way to start than that crazy description of Damien's execution in 1757?
Yeah, okay, that opening scene, it was intense. It's hard to believe people actually watched those gruesome public executions. I mean, public torture, drawing, and quartering.
It's striking, right?
It's wild.
It is. Foucault definitely picked that graphic account on purpose to show how theatrical punishment was way back then. Remember that quote where he talks about the execution being a piece of theater? It was all orchestrated, to show off the sovereign's power over life and death.
Oh, yeah. It makes you wonder, did people back then see it as entertainment? Or was it more about making everyone scared and obedient?
Foucault argues it was both. Those public displays of brutality, they were meant to deter crime by making an example out of the person being punished.
Right.
But they also were like this ritual to show the sovereign's power, a way to keep the social hierarchy going strong.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But then Foucault describes this change, moving away from public torture and execution and towards something that seems more humane. But was it really about being humane? Or was there more to it?
That is the question. Foucault doesn't agree that this change was just about being nice. He says public executions started causing problems, even for those in power. Remember, Foucault was looking at France during the Enlightenment, a time of huge social and political change. And he argued that public executions could actually backfire. The condemned could become martyrs, and that would cause unrest instead of stopping it.
Oh, wow. So those reformers who wanted to get rid of torture and public executions, they weren't just being nice.
Yeah. Exactly. Foucault says they also wanted a punishment that worked better, a punishment that was good for the new modern state.
Okay, and that's where the prison comes in, right?
Right. But the prison wasn't like the obvious choice for punishment. In fact, Foucault says that the early reformers in France thought prisons were a bad idea. They thought it was connected to the arbitrary power of the king, and they actually thought it was less fair than a public execution.
Wait, less fair. How does that make sense?
Well, think about it. In the pre-modern period, anyone could be publicly executed, no matter their social status.
Oh, yeah.
The guillotine, which Foucault talks about, was seen as more humane, a more equal way to execute because it was quick and painless for everyone.
Makes sense.
But imprisonment, to them, it wasn't universal. It could be used to target certain groups without anyone really watching like they did with public executions.
I see. So what changed? How did the prison become the main form of punishment?
Foucault traces this shift by looking at some key models of prisons that popped up in the 18th and 19th centuries. He talks about places like the Rathhuis of Amsterdam, the Maison de Force at Ghent, and the Walnut Street Prison in Philadelphia. These early models tried to make punishment more systematic, moving away from public spectacle and towards a more controlled environment.
So it was less about inflicting pain on the body and more about changing the person through work and discipline.
Exactly. Foucault highlights how these models introduce new things like the timetable, rules, and regulations. Think how different that is from punishment in the pre-modern period. It was all arbitrary and kind of chaotic.
Right. And this, according to Foucault, is where this idea of disciplinary power really comes from.
You got it. Foucault says these new models weren't just about being nice. They represented a whole new way of exercising power. The focus shifted from punishing the body to disciplining and changing the person.
Okay, so less about punishing the crime itself and more about making that person a well-behaved member of society. Someone who contributes, I guess.
Precisely. And this is what Foucault says made disciplinary power so different from the older forms of punishment. It was about shaping individuals through constant surveillance and making everything normal and regulated, not just stopping bad behavior.
He uses some interesting metaphors to explain this change in power.
He does. Like when he compares the executioner and the physician, he argues that while the executioner represents the power of the sovereign over life and death, the physician, they represent a more subtle kind of power. They don't just punish or cure, they observe, they diagnose, and they intervene in a person's life. They end up shaping the person's behavior and their health.
So it's like power in the modern world is less obvious, but It's everywhere, right?
Exactly. And that's what makes it so effective. It works through these everyday things, timetables, rules, examinations, but they all work together to control our behavior, to make us docile and productive.
He even talks about how this power plays out in the design of spaces, like how buildings are built to control how we move.
You're thinking of partitioning, right? Where space is carefully divided and organized to manage individual behavior. He points to classrooms, factories, and of course prisons.
Yeah.
Each person has their own spot, their movements are limited, and they're being watched all the time. It's like a power grid where everyone is visible and controllable.
It's almost like that panopticon thing, where you
Yeah.
always feel like you're being watched, even if you don't know for sure.
That's a great connection. Foucault was definitely influenced by Bentham's panopticon. He saw it as a perfect example of how disciplinary power works in modern society. But we'll dig into that more in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
For now, let's stick with some other techniques that Foucault says are key to disciplinary power.
One that really stood out to me was his discussion of hierarchical observation.
Oh, yes. That's where Foucault talks about power working through constant surveillance.
Yeah.
He uses the example of the Oberkampf manufactory, which was built in 1791. This building was made so that supervisors could walk up and down a central aisle and watch the workers, see how they were doing, how hard they were working, and how good their work was. Like a human assembly line, where everyone is visible and being judged all the time.
That's so relevant today with all the cameras and surveillance technology. It feels like we're always being watched, doesn't it?
You're right. It's definitely something we see a lot with today's technology. But remember, Foucault was writing back in the 1970s, before all this digital stuff.
Yeah, that's true.
His point is, this kind of surveillance, this feeling of being watched, it's not new. It's been part of modern societies for ages. It works through different institutions and techniques.
It's not just about watching people, though. It's about judging them, too. Measuring them against some kind of standard.
You're thinking of normalizing judgment, right? That's another crucial part of disciplinary power, according to Foucault. It's all about setting a standard for behavior and then comparing everyone to that standard.
Right.
Those who don't fit the norm, they get corrected, punished, or excluded.
It's like that bell curve from statistics. You want to be in the middle, not too far out on either side.
Exactly. It makes people want to conform, fit in, and be normal. And Foucault says this happens everywhere. Schools, factories, hospitals, you name it.
Right. He even talks about the Brothers of the Christian Schools. They had this whole system of rewards and punishments for students, ranking them on how they behaved and how well they did in class.
Exactly. And Foucault points out this system wasn't just about rewarding good behavior. It was also about shaming those who didn't follow the rules.
Yeah.
He even mentions a shameful class where the worst students were separated from the others and had to wear sackcloth.
It's amazing how these things, rankings, classifications, rewards, and punishments can all work together to make us behave a certain way, to enforce conformity.
That's what's so insightful about Foucault. He helps us see that power doesn't just come from big announcements and obvious displays of force. It works through these subtle, often invisible techniques that are all around us in our daily lives.
And all these techniques, according to Foucault, come together in one very specific procedure: the examination.
The examination, yeah. For Foucault, that's where power and knowledge perfectly meet. It's how individuals are observed, documented, and classified, making them both visible and controllable.
He uses the example of the military, how soldiers are drilled to hold their bodies just so, to move with precision, to instantly respond to commands.
Exactly. Foucault quotes from a military training manual that stresses the need for uniformity, control over every detail of how a soldier stands and moves. He even talks about how this training creates a temporal modulation, always being assessed and corrected, with progress meticulously documented over time.
It sounds like they're turning them into machines.
You're not far off from Foucault's point. He argues that the examination isn't just a one-time thing. It's a constant process of being watched, evaluated, and recorded. It creates this permanent file on the individual, allowing for comparisons and control all the time.
And this examination model goes beyond the military, right? We see it in schools and hospitals, too.
Precisely. Foucault argues that the examination becomes a crucial tool for making individuals into well-behaved, useful members of society. Think about it. We're constantly being evaluated and assessed. Through grades, performance reviews, medical checkups, even social media likes and followers. It's all part of this larger system of disciplinary power.
It's fascinating and a little scary how all these different institutions use similar techniques to discipline people.
It is.
And it seems like the prison is where these techniques become even more extreme, more widespread.
That's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore how the prison, for Foucault, becomes like the ultimate expression of disciplinary power in action. Welcome back to Sociology, droids. We've been really getting into Foucault's argument about how punishment has changed and how disciplinary power came about. Last time we were talking about techniques like partitioning, hierarchical observation, and normalizing judgment, and how they turn people into, well, docile bodies.
Yeah.
So now let's look at how the prison embodies these disciplinary techniques.
I'm really interested to hear how Foucault approaches this. Because he's already said that the prison wasn't the obvious choice, even calling it problematic in some ways.
You're right. Remember, Foucault is looking at how prisons developed in France,
Yeah.
where imprisonment was seen as something the monarchy would use, like arbitrarily. Reformers back in the 18th century actually thought it was a bad thing. They saw it as a tool of despotism, not progress. Foucault even quotes reformers like Servin, who argued that the monarchy, under the pretext of punishing, had given itself the right to imprison people indefinitely.
Wow, it's interesting how our views on imprisonment have totally changed,
Yeah.
right? What happened that made the prison so important for punishment?
Foucault lays out this historical change really carefully. He goes through all these different models of prisons. He talks about places like the Rasvues of Amsterdam, the Maison de Force at Ghent, and the Walnut Street prison in Philadelphia. And even though they were all a bit different, they were all trying to make punishment more systematic, moving away from the chaos and randomness of public torture and executions.
So it was about bringing order, right? Making the system more controlled and predictable.
Right. These institutions introduced things that would become really important in modern prisons: timetables, rules, and regulations.
Okay.
Everything was controlled, from the prisoners' daily routines to their work to how they interacted with each other. Foucault actually says these institutions mark the moment when detention replaced punishment, when breaking the rules was replaced by behavior that needed correction. And he says this is when lawyers and judges were replaced by psychiatrists, prison officers, doctors, educators, and social workers.
It sounds like they were creating this perfectly controlled world, using these techniques to make people conform.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Foucault says these institutions were like labs for disciplinary power, where they could refine their techniques, shaping individuals not through force, but through careful control and regulation.
And work played a big part in this too, right? It wasn't just about locking people up, but also about changing them through work.
Exactly. Foucault talks about how work became a core part of being in prison in these models. But it's really important to remember that this wasn't about giving them meaningful work or teaching valuable skills. It was about using work as a disciplinary tool to control their time, their bodies, even their minds.
Right, so it wasn't about rehabilitation like we think of it today, but more about control, making people behave through forced activity.
Yes. Foucault actually compares this to what he calls the penalty of representation, which was all about the crime itself,
Okay.
punishing the person for breaking the law. But the prison represents a shift to what he calls the penalty of coercion, which was all about changing the person's behavior, making them into an obedient, productive subject.
So this shift really changed how power works, right? It's not just about stopping bad behavior, but actively shaping people through constant surveillance and discipline.
You got it. And the prison, with its walls, its routines, and the constant observation, it becomes the perfect place for this kind of power.
Foucault even brings up Bentham's panopticon, right? That design where prisoners could be watched at any time, even if they didn't know for sure.
Right. The panopticon for Foucault wasn't just about prisons. It was about how power works in our modern world. This idea of potential surveillance, it forces people to discipline themselves. Foucault says, he who is subjected to a field of visibility and who knows it assumes responsibility for the constraints of power. He makes them play spontaneously upon himself. He inscribes in himself the power relation in which he simultaneously plays both roles. He becomes the principle of his own subjection.
It's like the prison walls aren't just physical. It creates this feeling of being watched all the time, like we see with cameras, smartphones, everything we do online. It's like we're all living in some kind of digital panopticon.
That's a really interesting thought, right? But remember, Foucault was writing way before the internet and all this digital surveillance. His point is that this idea of always being watched and the pressure to conform, it's not new. It's been a part of modern society for a long time. And for him, the prison is like the ultimate symbol of this power dynamic.
But Foucault doesn't just stop at how prisons are designed or how surveillance works, right? He also talks about the knowledge that's produced about criminals within the prison system. He talks about how the prison actually creates this idea of the delinquent.
You're exactly right. That's really crucial to Foucault's argument. The prison, while it's trying to reform people, actually creates this whole category of the delinquent. By watching, documenting, and categorizing everything criminals do, the prison system makes the delinquent into this specific type of person, someone to be studied and controlled.
It's like they're creating a whole new area of knowledge about crime, which then makes it okay to intervene even more, to control even more.
Right. And this knowledge about the delinquent doesn't stay inside the prison walls. It affects legal practices, social policies, and even how we think about people labeled as criminals.
So the prison isn't just a place of punishment. It's a place where knowledge is created, a laboratory for studying and classifying anyone who's seen as deviant. Foucault even uses the term moral accounting to describe how they keep track of everything a prisoner does and how they measure them against the norm, even inside the prison.
Yes, Foucault carefully breaks down how this moral accounting works to make punishment really personal.
Right.
They tailor it to the specific needs of the delinquent. It's not just about punishing the crime anymore, it's about reforming the person, making them fit into society. Foucault points out that, ironically, this actually reinforces the idea of the delinquent as a distinct category, someone defined by their criminal behavior and always needing to be watched and corrected.
But Foucault also brings up this really strange paradox, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He says that the prison ultimately doesn't stop crime. He even suggests that it actually creates delinquency.
That's one of the most challenging and controversial things Foucault says.
It is.
He argues that the harsh conditions, the forced labor, all that surveillance, it doesn't actually help people change. It actually makes them more likely to commit crimes again.
Wow.
He talks about how prisons can become places where criminal networks grow, where people learn how to be better criminals and develop a shared identity as delinquents. Foucault says that despite the prison's goal of rehabilitation, what it really does is create and maintain this class of delinquents.
So the system that's supposed to deal with crime ends up making it worse.
That's the paradox that Foucault is highlighting. He's not saying that prisons are deliberately trying to create more criminals,
Okay.
but he is saying that how they work, their whole logic, naturally leads to more delinquency. The prison, for Foucault, isn't the answer to crime, it's part of the problem.
This is really thought-provoking stuff. And it sounds like what Foucault is saying goes way beyond just prisons. He's suggesting that these disciplinary techniques are everywhere in our society.
Exactly, and that's where we'll pick up next time. We'll dig into Foucault's concept of the carceral network and look at how the prison, for him, becomes a model for how power works in all of modern society. It's going to get really interesting.
Welcome back to Sociology Droids. We've been spending some time with Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish. We've been talking about how punishment has changed, how disciplinary power came to be. Last time we talked about how, for Foucault, the prison actually creates more delinquency, even though it's trying to rehabilitate people. It's a pretty weird idea, right?
Yeah, it is. And Foucault takes it even further, you know. He says that the prison isn't just a building, it's like a model for how power works throughout our whole society. He calls this the carceral network.
Carceral network, okay. So is he saying that we're all living in a prison?
Not literally, of course. But he's saying that those techniques we see in prisons, things like surveillance, discipline, and making everything normal, they've spread out into society, shaping everything, our institutions, our daily lives. Like, think about it, schools, hospitals, factories, even the military. They all use these things to some extent.
Right, yeah. I see what you mean. It's like the prison is this blueprint for how to control people.
Exactly. Foucault traces how this carceral network reaches beyond the prison walls. One example is the police record, you know. That document basically replaces a convict's passport. It keeps track of them even after they've served their sentence.
So even when they're out, they're still stuck in that system of surveillance. It's like a shadow that follows them.
Yeah, exactly. And Foucault says that this constant surveillance creates this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, making it really hard for ex-convicts to, get back into society.
Right.
They're constantly being judged for their past, and it limits what they can do in the present and future.
So this carceral network basically makes sure that delinquent label sticks.
Yeah.
Right. Makes it hard to escape that. It's a system that just keeps going.
You got it. That's Foucault's main point. He's showing how power works, not just through force, but through these subtle ways of controlling people, things that are everywhere in our institutions and everyday lives. He even talks about how the media plays a part in this, shaping how people see crime and criminals.
That's right. He talks about how criminals used to be celebrated in popular culture, the celebrated criminal. That doesn't happen anymore.
Exactly. The delinquent isn't seen as some rebellious outlaw anymore. Instead, they're treated like they're sick, defined by their crimes and subject to all this scrutiny and control.
It makes you think about how we see news today, online especially. It's this constant stream of crime stories, and a lot of times it reinforces those stereotypes and fears.
It's definitely something to think about. Foucault was writing in a different time, before the internet and everything, but his ideas about how the media shapes our views on crime and punishment are still so relevant.
So for Foucault, the prison is more than just a place to punish criminals. It's a microcosm of our society, showing how power is used to control and manage individuals.
Exactly. And what's so amazing about Foucault's work is that it makes us question all these institutions and practices we usually just accept without thinking. He makes us see how power works, not in big dramatic ways, but through these subtle mechanisms that shape our thoughts, our actions, even who we are.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. Discipline and Punish is a tough book, but it gives us a powerful way to understand how power, knowledge, and social control all work together.
I agree. Foucault's work challenges us to look at the world in a new way, to question the systems and structures that shape our lives. And that's a valuable tool for everyone, especially those of us who are studying sociology. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Discipline and Punish. It's been a really fascinating exploration.